Even the declassified reports contradict each other on this. And that right there should tell you something, because every other video on this story presents it like settled history. It isn't. What actually happened over North Carolina on the night of January 24th, 1961 is stranger, messier, and more unsettling than the version you've probably heard. Near Goldsboro, North Carolina, a Boeing B-52 Stratofortress carrying 2 Mark 39 nuclear bombs broke up in midair and dropped its nuclear payload. That's the part everyone agrees on. What they don't agree on is how close any of it came to going off, and the gap between those two versions of the story is where things get genuinely disturbing. We're going to go through what actually happened, what the government's own engineers said about it behind closed doors, and then we'll get to the detail at the end that almost nobody talks about, the one that quietly rewrote the rules of nuclear command for the entire Cold War. The aircraft, a B-52G, based at Seymour Johnson Air Force Base in Goldsboro, was on a 24-hour Operation Coverall airborne alert mission along the Atlantic seaboard. And here's the first thing most people don't realize. This wasn't unusual. At the height of the Cold War, United States policy was to keep armed aircraft in the air at all times in the event of a conflict. There was a constant rotating conveyor belt of nuclear-armed bombers flying over or near American soil around the clock. This plane wasn't some special exception. It was one aircraft in a continuous ladder of live nuclear weapons in the sky every single day. The plane that crashed was flying 10 miles northeast of Seymour Johnson Air Force Base, and internal structural damage had begun inside the right wing during refueling over South Carolina 3 hours earlier. After holding offshore east of Wilmington for about 2 hours to burn off fuel and await advice from the manufacturer Boeing, it was attempting to land at Seymour Johnson when things went wrong. The right wing broke apart, then part of the tail. The captain ordered the crew to eject at 9,000 feet. 5 crewmen successfully ejected or bailed out and landed safely. Another ejected but did not survive the landing, and 2 were killed in the crash. One of those survivors did something almost no one has ever done. A lieutenant on that crew bailed out through the B-52's top hatch without an ejection seat, a maneuver considered so physically difficult that he's remembered as the only person known to have successfully pulled it off. Think about what that means for a second. The plane is disintegrating around you. You're at 9,000 feet, and you climb out through the top. That's the crew. Now let's talk about the bombs. As a result of the breakup of the plane, 2 Mark 39 nuclear weapons were released at a height of between 10,000 and 2,000 feet. One of the Mark 39 bombs deployed its parachute and ended up stuck in a tree, with its nose just barely touching the ground. The second bomb fell free, without its parachute deploying, and broke apart on impact. Now here's where the story gets complicated, and where every version you've seen before probably glosses over the most interesting part. During the breakup, the fuselage was spinning and heading back toward Earth, and the centrifugal forces pulled on a lanyard in the cockpit, exactly as a crew member would if he wanted to release its hydrogen bombs over enemy territory. Read that again. The plane, tearing itself apart over a tobacco field in North Carolina, accidentally performed the exact same physical action that a pilot would perform to drop a nuclear bomb on Moscow. One of the weapons in particular went through all of its arming steps to detonate, and when it hit the ground, a firing signal was actually sent. 7 of 8 arming, fusing, and firing switches and devices in one bomb automatically actuated. Only a crew-controlled switch prevented a nuclear detonation. That's the version you've heard. One switch from catastrophe. And it became one of the most repeated facts in Cold War history. But there's a problem with it, and this is the part that almost nobody mentions. A declassified Sandia National Laboratory report, published by the National Security Archive in 2014, found that both multi-megaton Mark 39 bombs involved in the mishap were actually in the safe position. While both bombs were in the safe position, the report concluded that by the time one of them hit the ground, it was in the armed setting because of the impact of the crash. If the shock had not also damaged the switch contacts, the weapon could have detonated. So here's the tension. The engineers who showed up at the scene saw the ARM/SAFE switch in the armed position and concluded the bomb had nearly gone off. The forensic hardware analysis done later concluded the switch had physically been knocked into the arm position by the crash itself, not by an actual live arming sequence. When excavators located the second bomb, the safety switch was off, and the device was set to arm, but it was later revealed that the aircraft breakup caused damage to some switch contacts, making the switches ineffective. The indicator had likely been rotated to armed due to the impact. A Sandia safety engineer put it plainly. One safety device was the pre-arming switch, which is operated by a 28-volt signal. Some people could say the bomb worked exactly like designed. Others can say all but one switch operated, and that one switch prevented the nuclear detonation. Unfortunately, there had been some 30-some incidents where the ready-safe switch was operated inadvertently. We're fortunate that the weapons involved at Goldsboro were not suffering from that same malady. That last line. The same type of switch that saved North Carolina had accidentally activated on its own in dozens of other incidents. The reason it didn't happen here wasn't necessarily superior engineering. It was, by their own admission, fortune. And here's the thing that makes all of this even harder to sit with. A safety modification to Mark 39 Mod 2 weapons known as Alt 197 had been approved in January 1960, but not yet applied to all deployed weapons prior to the Goldsboro accident, and was not applied to the weapons involved in the accident. The fix existed. It had been approved a full year before the crash. It just hadn't been installed on these particular bombs. Alt 197 replaced an older arm/safe switch with a newer design that would prevent any electrical current from being available anywhere within the bomb when the switch was in the safe position. A modification sitting on a shelf, unapproved for these two specific weapons, for 12 months. The weapons safety engineer who wrote the internal post-mortem on all of this titled his document, How I Learned to Mistrust the H-Bomb. Parker F. Jones at the Sandia National Laboratories analyzed the accident and concluded, the Mk-39 Mod 2 bomb did not possess adequate safety for the airborne alert role in the B-52. That's not an anti-nuclear activist. That's the guy inside the program, writing for internal consumption, saying the bomb they were flying around the clock over American cities wasn't safe enough to be flying around the clock over American cities. Now, about the second bomb, the one that hit the ground and broke apart. Recovery crews dug down 50 feet into that waterlogged North Carolina farmland. The decision was made to leave the remaining portions of the weapon containing uranium, believed to have entered the water table, in the ground. As a precaution, the government purchased part of the site and still maintains an easement in order to prevent digging in the vicinity. Part of a hydrogen bomb is still in the ground on a private farm in North Carolina right now, and the government holds a legal easement on that land, meaning you need federal permission to dig there. There is no plan to retrieve it. If you're watching this and thinking, I had no idea any of this happened, that's kind of the point. In July 2012, the state of North Carolina erected a historical road marker in the town of Eureka, just 3 miles north of the crash site, commemorating the crash under the title, Nuclear Mishap. One small road sign. Most people driving down Faro Road have no idea what happened a few hundred yards behind it. If you've made it this far, drop a comment below. I genuinely want to know, did you already know about this, or is this the first you're hearing of it? And if you know someone who thinks the Cold War was just a distant standoff between two superpowers who kept things under control, send them this video. Because what comes next is the part that most retellings completely leave out. Here's what Goldsboro actually changed. According to declassified meeting notes, Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara described crashes of U.S. aircraft, one in North Carolina and one in Texas, where, by the slightest margin of chance, literally the failure of 2 wires to cross, a nuclear explosion was averted. He concluded that despite their best efforts, the possibility of an accidental nuclear explosion still existed. McNamara didn't say this publicly. He said it in a top-secret 1963 meeting, specifically to block a NATO push to hand nuclear launch authority down to the Supreme Allied Commander in Europe. He used what happened over Goldsboro as his argument for why you couldn't trust the chain of command with that kind of power. A B-52 breaking apart over a tobacco field in Wayne County, North Carolina, directly shaped who gets to authorize a nuclear strike in a NATO war. That's the mega loop closing right there. As a result of the Goldsboro accident, many new safety devices were placed on U.S. nuclear weapons, and the Soviets were encouraged to do the same. The number and intensity of airborne alert missions were slowed by President Kennedy after several crashes, including the one near Goldsboro. So here's where we started: a routine Cold War flight, a fuel leak, and 2 hydrogen bombs falling out of the sky. Here's where we ended up: a crash that the government's own engineers called a near disaster, a safety fix that existed and wasn't installed, a piece of an H-bomb still in the ground, and a Secretary of Defense using the whole incident to rewrite the rules of nuclear command at the highest levels of NATO. According to a Sandia Laboratory 1959 study, the Cold War goal of keeping nuclear weapons in a high state of readiness meant that safety was fundamentally a matter of playing percentages. They knew. They said it out loud, in classified documents to each other, and then they kept flying. If this kind of deep dive is what you're here for, the video on the right goes into another Cold War incident that stayed buried even longer than Goldsboro, and it's just as hard to believe it actually happened. Hit subscribe if you want more of these, because there are a lot more stories like this one that most people have never heard. And seriously, leave a comment. The debate about how close this actually came is still alive, and I want to know which side of it you land on.